Hello, how's it going everyone? Today we've got a bit of a longer video in store and that's because we're going to take this app here. It's a small React app that connects to the Unsplash API and right now it uses set state. So you can search for llamas or whatever. It gives you the nice beautiful results. And it's all being done in just like a typical Create React app using set state. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that and we're going to convert it over to MobX so you can see how that would work. And then we're going to go back to the set state version again and convert that over to Redux. So that at the end of the day, you've sort of seen two conversions and you'll be able to compare the differences between how it might be done in Redux and how it might be done in MobX. So I hope it's useful. Let's get started. So first, just like a quick overview, it's a standard Create React app that renders app into a div. So we go in here to app, and it's got some state here in the app component. So we've got the term the person searched for, an array of the images found, and its status. So as soon as we component will mount, as soon as that happens, we're going to go and we're going to fetch some mountains. So fetch images is just a little function, async because we're doing some promise stuff here with Axios. So whenever you start a search, we're going to basically set the state to searching with the term, and there's no images at this point. So we're going to try to make this call, and we're going to call Axios get and await the response and put it here. Please don't hack my client ID. Anyways, as soon as we get this response back, we're going to set state with that. So our status is now updated to done, and that grabs the, with Axios, the way you get the body of the response is with response.data, and then that's an object that has some results, which are the images themselves. But what if there's an error? So we're going to catch that, and then we're just going to change the status to error. So let's go look at how it's actually rendered. We're just going to extract the three properties from our state so that we can use them down here. We've got a form component, which we are passing down our fetch images function as a prop. And then we're dealing with the different statuses. So when it's searching, we're just going to say we're searching for whatever term. If it's done and there's no images, so length is 0, we're going to very nicely tell them, sorry sucker, there's no results for whatever they searched for. It's my unhappy face. If there's an error, we're just going to tell them oops, error. And now we've got the actual images down here. So they're in a div, and then we're going to, let's just fix this since we're here. We don't have to access that because I've extracted it here. But anyways, so we got an array of images and we're going to map them. And for each of these, we can also fix this, just so you guys can see some refactoring as we're going right here. Since we're just going to return, get rid of that, get rid of that. Is that right? Yeah, there we go. All right, so we're mapping the images, and each image is going to be mapped to the image component where we're passing down the image data. And then we've also need a key since we're mapping. Anytime you map, you need a key. So we're just using the ID of that image. So let's take a look at the form. So it receives this fetch images function. And down here, we've got a form where on submit, we're calling this on submit function here, passing the event. We're going to prevent the default so we don't actually submit the form. And then we're going to grab the term that they entered into the input. So the way we can do that is we have a ref to this input, which was set up down here. So now that we have the DOM element, we can get its value. And then we can call the function that was passed down as a prop, passing the term, which will kick off the whole API call to Unsplash. So come back here, we'll just take a look at the image and then we'll get into the conversion. So we've got our image component. It receives an image. Here you'd probably be better off doing shape and like describing the shape of this object, but I, for this demo, didn't do that. Shame on me. Cool, so down here, we've got the image. We're just putting it into a variable. We're doing a bit of work to get the proper description, and then we're just displaying this stuff. So the description, the link, the actual image itself is down here. So we're grabbing the small URL and just putting it as the source. And that's what we got here. So it's working because I made a few changes. So I'm going to commit that, and then we can start our conversion. Okay, so what do? We fixed up our mapping. Cool. So let's go into a new branch, and we'll just call this, we're going to do MobX first. So we'll do that. We're in a new branch. And the first thing we're going to do is add the libraries we need. So we're going to add MobX and MobX React. So we're just waiting for these to install. Hopefully it'll be pretty quick. Cool. And we'll start this thing up again. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is let's create a folder. I typically create a folder called stores, and we're going to just start building our store. So we're going to call this the, what's this called? We'll call this the gallery store.js. So unlike if you've done Redux before, in MobX, both your data and your functions which change that data live in the same place, and it's called the store. So what we're going to do is import a few different functions from the library. So we're going to import observable, and we're going to import action, and this is from MobX. And I'll explain what these do as we go. So typically what we do is we just declare a store here, and all it is a ES6 class. So in here we need to basically define the data that we want to keep track of. So if we come out here, it's basically these three things here: term, images, and status. So we're going to say observable. This is a decorator, and we're basically saying we want to decorate the thing that we type next, wrap it in this observable function. And what we have first is our term, which starts out as an empty string. We have an observable images, which is an empty array. And we have an observable status, which I think was initial. Cool. So any state or property that you want to keep track of changes to, you want other things to be able to observe changes, you need to use this observable decorator to make that work. Otherwise, you just change the value and nothing happens because it's not being observed. So the next thing in MobX is you have actions. And what actions are functions that have the ability to make changes to the observable values. So if we look back here, we have one called fetch images. And I'm actually just going to copy this entire function. And we're going to get rid of that. And we're going to get rid of our state here because we're not going to be using state anymore. Well, we have state, just it's not the one that comes with React, the one that will be living in our MobX store. So we paste this massive thing here. And what do we call this? Fetch images, right? Yeah, fetch images. So fetch images is equal to an async function that does this stuff. All right. So the first thing we were doing is we were basically making some changes to the state here. And in MobX, all you have to do is access those properties and change their values. And MobX handles everything it can detect when things have been changed, and it will notify everyone else who's observing the changes. So status is searching. And then we've got term is equal to term. And we've got images is equal to an empty array. All right, so we've done that part. Now we're going to move on and deal with these parts here. So one somewhat tricky thing is we've got some AJAX code going on, right? So it's asynchronous. And even though it reads sort of from top to bottom, that's only because we're using async await. So in the background, what's really happening is we've essentially got a promise, and we're going to wait for this promise to be resolved, and then we're going to put it into the response and continue on. So even though it doesn't look like it, technically this code sort of down below the await happens later on, not in the original function call. So because of that, you're technically not supposed to change the state here, because it's technically no longer happening in this action anymore. It's happening in like a .then sort of a promise resolver function. So there's two ways you can sort of solve this, and I have a whole video on this, so if you want to check that out. But what we can essentially do is just create a couple other actions. So let's say we'll call this set images, and it will take in some images, and then it will say images are equal to images, and the status is done when this happens, right? Cool. So now we can get rid of this, and we can just call set images, and we can pass our response. Oh, what was it again? This response.data.results. So by doing it this way, now that we're calling a new action, it is it's changing the observable properties right in an action. So we're all good. I'll show you the other way next, just so you can see a change. There's another way you can do is run in action. And essentially you can wrap this little changing the observable properties in run in action. And we would simply say in here, this.status equals error. So now, even though it lives within this code here, we're all good because it's running in here, and that basically MobX runs it as if it were in an action. There's a couple other ways to deal with this as well, but here's two ways, and you guys can sort of decide which you like the best. All right, so we've got our store basically set up. Let's just create we'll just export it. So I'm just going to actually export default right at the top. Cool. So now that we've got our store, we need basically a way to connect this store with our React code. And we do that similar to how it's done in Redux, actually. And we basically wrap what's called a provider around this app component, and that allows us to basically pass our store into the components. Because normal components, here's a nice little box, the state lives inside of the box. Whereas with Redux or MobX or like state managers, you're sort of taking the state out of the component, and then you need to pass that back in somehow. So what we're going to do is we're going to import provider from MobX React, and we will wrap that around our app component. Like that. And then to be able to access the store within our app, we need to basically pass it to the provider. So now we can import that. We can import our gallery store, and that comes from, that stores gallery store. So right now it's still just a class. What we want is like one store, an instance of one. So we're just going to instantiate it, and we'll say gallery store is equal to new gallery store. And then that's what we'll pass to our provider. So the gallery store is equal to gallery, just like that. So, all right, we got an error. We'll fix that, and then we'll keep going. So Axios is not defined in the store. That's because it was happening in our app. So we're going to take that out, bring it up here, see if that fixes it. All right. So our next issue, remember we deleted this function fetch images that used to live inside of the app right here. This used to live sort of right below here. It's no longer there. So if we want to be able to call this function, we need to access our store. And the way we do that is we have to inject our store into our component. So we're going to import inject, and another one which we'll talk about in a sec, observer, from MobX React. And then because we've got the ability to use promises, we can just say that we want to inject the gallery store, and we want to make this app component an observer of this store. So basically what that means is anytime one of the observable properties changes in the gallery store, because this thing is an observer, it's going to observe the changes and react to them, which will basically cause React to re-render, to render the updated information. So we still have an issue here is fetch images doesn't live within this class. So how does the store get passed into the component? And it gets passed as props. So we have props.gallery store. Now we can call our fetch images action. So the next little issue we have is that these things don't live in state here. And we can keep this as is actually, and we just got to say that it now comes from props.gallery store instead. So that fixes that. The last thing we need to change is we actually don't need to pass this function down anymore. So typically when you're doing component state, you have your state live up here in the top level component, and you pass your state down, but you also pass your functions down, which can change the state because a child can't directly change the state in its parent. So you need to pass a function down, a way for your children to call a function which changes the state. With MobX, we can sort of inject the store at any level, so we don't need to pass that down. But what we do need to do is go into the form, and we need to inject our store into this as well. So we're going to import inject and observer from MobX React again. We're going to inject the gallery store here, and then we're going to make it an observer. So remember, we're not passing this function down, so we'll just get rid of this prop types here. So we no longer need this either. And now when we call fetch images, it's not being passed as a prop. It's we have to access our gallery store first, and then we can call its action to fetch images. And it works. So let's just make sure. We'll search for Canada. Works great. See if we have any errors or warnings or anything. Nope. So let's just quickly go over here to the React inspector, and we'll see what's going on. So here we have our, make that a little bigger. Sorry, it makes everything bigger, but here we have our app component. And see that it doesn't live directly at the top anymore. It lives within the provider. But there's this new component that was sort of put here in between. And that's because we've injected the gallery store into our app. So what that inject decorator function does is it basically creates a new component which wraps your component, and it passes the store in as a prop. So now that we come to our app, we've got our prop here, which is the gallery store, which has the images and the actions we can use, and the status and all that stuff that we can access. Same with form. Remember we injected the gallery store into this level as well. So here's our form. It's also being injected, and we've got access to the gallery store here. So let's just zoom it out a little bit. And that's how it works. I'll just quickly show you, if you search something, it handles when it can't find results. And let's just cause an error so you can see the error handling. So that's wrong now. Load this and it fails right away and it shows error message. All right, so we're done with the MobX side. We're just going to commit this. We're going to switch back to the branch we started at, and then we're going to do the same thing with Redux so you can see what the differences are in that conversion. So let's go to the command line. We'll see the files we changed, and we'll just we'll add all those. Converting from component state to MobX. Commit that. And now we'll go back to our master branch and we'll start over. Cool. So for the Redux conversion, we also need to add a few different packages. And what we need to add are Redux, obviously, that's what we're using. And we're going to add React Redux, and we're going to add Thunk Redux. So this is the library itself. This is sort of the ability to mix Redux and React together. And then Thunk Redux is how we're going to deal with asynchronous code within Redux. We saw how it was done in MobX, either just calling a new action or wrapping it in a run in action function. In Redux, it's done a little bit differently, so we'll see how that works. So we'll add those. Oh geez, what is it? Redux Thunk, my bad. Okay, so it's being installed. And we'll start this up. Oh, all right, so I was going to do this in a new branch, right? But I've already changed my files. So I'm actually just going to stash those changes, go to a Redux branch, unstash or apply, and now I'm in my new branch with the changes and I didn't affect the old one where I came from. So now we can start this one again. Oh, I almost forgot. I got this nice little diagram I wanted to show before we get into Redux. So basically how the MobX flow works is that we've got actions, which are just functions. What they do is they can update the observable properties, which is our state. And then those changes get basically sent down to anything that is observing the observable properties, which in this case is our component. There's another thing we didn't talk about, computed, but they basically can derive information from our observable properties. So say we had like a bunch of images in an array, and we wanted the ability to easily get the length of them, how many. We could create a little function that returns us the length. And anytime our observable properties change, our computed will also change at the same time. So then once in our component, we can call our action, which starts the whole flow again. So that's basically the flow of MobX, how data gets from your store into your component. All right, so we've got Redux installed, and now we need to get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with our store. And this is just some setup to be able to use Redux properly. So we're going to import a couple libraries, and and functions, and we're going to call and use create store and apply middleware. And those both come from Redux itself. Oops. Next thing we want is Thunk, which will be from, what's it called? Redux Thunk, I think. Let me just make sure. I always mix up the order. Redux Thunk, okay. Okay, so we need something called a reducer. So we're going to import that even though it does not exist yet. With Redux, it's always a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. I guess you could start with your reducer, but I like to start with the store because that's sort of how I think about things first. So we'll come back to this in a sec. Okay, so now we're going to export default our create store. And what you do is you pass three things to this function. The first thing is your reducer. So the reducer is what handles essentially making changes to the data in our store, the state. The second one is our initial state. So if we open up this, this is our initial state. So we can put that. Oops. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. The next thing we need to do is call apply middleware and pass to this the thunk function. So what apply middleware does is it basically sits in between your reducer and when you dispatch actions to the reducer. And we're going to get into what all that means in a second. But this is used for our asynchronous code in Redux. So now that we've got this, let's go create our reducer. So we're going to create a new file. We'll call it reducer. And it's just a function, so export default. We'll do an arrow function here. So what our reducer receives is the current state, and just in case it's undefined or whatever, we'll make it an empty object. And it also receives something called an action. Now, action is basically just an object, a bunch of data that gets passed to the reducer, which helps the reducer determine what changes to make to the state. And typically what you do is you set up a big switch statement based on something called the type, which is a property of the action object that's sent to the reducer. And then you have a case statement for all the different types that you can have. So we're going to have a type that we'll call begin search. And what this is for is when we kick off, basically before we make a call to the API, we'll say that we've begun. And what we're going to return here is typically always, it's an object, it's the new version of the state. So the current state gets passed in, what gets returned is a new version of it. So you want to create a copy of the old one and then change the properties that need to be changed. So we're going to say that there's no images, and we're going to make the status searching. And I believe since we're beginning, we might as well set the term too. So the term can come over in the action object. Okay, so we've handled this one, the beginning. Now we're going to handle when it's done searching. So we're going to create a copy of the state. And we don't have to update the term because it hasn't changed at all since begin and done. And but we do need to update the images, so those are going to come over in the action. And then we need to change the status to done. Okay, next case, when there's an error. So those are the three sort of statuses that our AJAX call can have. Same thing, create a copy of the current state, and we're going to change what needs to be changed. So our status will become error. All right, so what happens if you call this reducer and it's not one of these three things? Basically, you want to return just a copy of whatever the state currently is. So to do that, we'll do a default case in our switch statement, and we'll just simply return the state. All right, so this is one part of having to use Redux. Unlike in MobX, where you're in an action and you can just sort of reach out and change the observable properties, in Redux, any change to the state needs to be done in this reducer. Okay, so what is this action thing? Where does it come from? How did I know what the different types are and whatnot? Those all come from what's called action creators. And they're basically just functions which can dispatch or send the action object to the reducer. And how do we know what these are? Just because you invent them. You're the one that decides what your different types are. Basically, how your data can be changed. So we're going to create another file called actions. And here's where you'd have basically a function for every time you want to eventually dispatch an action to your reducer. So even though the file's called actions, what these are functions, which are commonly referred to as action creators, because the action is just an object, as you'll see, whereas these are the functions which create those actions. So we need to create a function, and we call it fetch images, right? Which is essentially we're rebuilding this. So why don't we actually just start with this and move it over to our actions file. So I'm just going to say const, and then I'll export that here. Okay. So this is one of our action creators, a function. And there's a little bit of trickiness going on whenever you're dealing with async code inside of action creators. So I'm actually going to remove this, and I'll explain why in a sec. But let's just, before we even get into here, let's say we had a normal action creator. Change something, okay? So typically what you do is you just return an object which always has a type, so my type, and then any additional data that you need to send to your reducer so that it can modify the state in the way that it needs to. So say we've got a name, we're sending a name over because it needs that for some reason. But see here, all you're doing is returning this object. So this is the action which gets sent to the reducer that this switch statement uses. So this would be fine if this is sort of what we could do here below. Imagine we could just return an object here where we'd have our type begin search, and we wanted to pass our term along too. So ES6, I don't have to repeat it. I can just type it like that. We don't need to pass the images because when the type is begin search, the reducer knows that there's no images, so we can leave that off. But the problem is anytime you've got asynchronous code, or you sort of want to call the reducer 3 times or to dispatch actions to your reducer 3 times, you can't just return an object because then you'd be done, you'd be out of the function, right? It wouldn't keep going down in the code. So instead what you do, so we're going to get rid of that. This was an example, so we're just going to get rid of that. Instead what you do is you return a function, and what this function will do is it will receive something called dispatch. So dispatch is a function that's passed to this arrow function anytime you want to send or dispatch an action to the reducer. So anytime you want to trigger some change in the state. So all of this code now needs to go inside of this function that's being returned. So I'll just, something's not working. Okay, what am I doing wrong? Nothing there. We'll paste this in. It's probably because I can't call this .setState or something like that. Because we need Axios here. Okay, so there is no this .setState. Instead, what you do is you call dispatch and you pass an object to it. And this object needs to contain everything that your reducer will need to update the state. So we wanted to pass, you always have to pass a type. So this was begin search. And we just wanted to pass the term along too. So that part's done. So now we've got our try code, which wants to modify the state in 2 places. So again, we replace this to a call to dispatch where we're sending this action object over to our reducer. And here we're going to send a type that's done search along with the images that the reducer needs to change the state. Now we also want to handle what if it catches an error. You know the drill now. So we want to dispatch an object with a type that was error search, and we don't need that there. All right, so I have a syntax error somewhere, and I'm trying to figure out where. All right, is it this thing? Okay, this is that. Where's this? That's that. This is that. Oh, geez. All right, let's get this good first. Okay, so that's good. Now we're gonna paste this in here. We got our try, catch, so this isn't needed. But there's still an error. Oh! All right, I know what it is. The issue is that I was using await and I never defined async. That is why. So you may think you type async here, which is your fetch images function, but the truth is that the asynchronous code runs inside of this function instead. So now it formats on save because I got the async await properly. So when this gets called, we're returning an async function which receives a dispatch function. Anytime we want to change the state now, we call dispatch passing it the action object, which gets sent to the reducer, which can, based on the type, essentially it's always like create a copy of the state, modify a few fields, then return the new version of it. All right, so this is good to go. Now we've essentially got the Redux part of it done. Now we need to do what we did in MobX, where we injected and made our components and observers. But in Redux, that's called to connect your store to your component. So we go to our index, and just like MobX, we need a provider. And that gives us the ability to inject in MobX's case or connect in Redux's case our store to our components. So this comes from, what is it? React Redux. And we also need our store. So we'll import that. So now we wrap our provider with our store around our app. Cool. So now our app has the ability to be connected to our Redux store. So we probably got some crazy errors. Yep, this function doesn't exist because we deleted it, so let's go fix that. So we're going to be working in the app for now. We no longer need our state because we no longer need Axios. So let's figure out how we can connect this component to our store. So let's not export it yet. We'll come down to the bottom and we're going to now export. And what we're going to use is this connect function, which returns a function that we pass our component to. So we need to import this first. So import connect from, React Redux. So now we can use the connect. So what does it want to receive? It wants to receive two other functions. People in Redux love functions, as you can tell. All right, so the first one is typically called map state to props. And it is a function which receives the state and returns an object. Okay, so what's going on here is that this function is called and we are given the state. But the state could be like 20 fields and you don't want to pass all of those things to your component, or maybe you even want to modify them a little bit. Like say you have an array of images and you want to sort them before passing them to your component. So that's where you can do all of that here. So what we are going to return, and if you remember here, we wanted to have access to these three things: term, status, and images. So we need to pass all of those along. So term is going to be the term from the state, images comes from there as well, and the status comes from the state as well. So I essentially passed everything. So you would have gotten away with just returning the whole state. But the problem is you don't know if new properties are going to be added in the future, and you probably don't need those in this component. So you don't want to pass things you don't need, so it's better to be explicit about what's being sent to your component. So this is the first function that gets passed to the connect function. The next one we do is called map dispatch to props, which receives this thing called dispatch, and we have to return an object. And these are essentially all of the different action creators that we can call. So we've only got one, which is this fetch images, but that's what we want to pass into our component so that we can call that there. So we're just going to give it the same name just to keep things simple. So what we are going to do is pass a function which receives the term, and then what we're going to do here is we're going to call dispatch, and what is going to be sent to the dispatch function is a call to the fetch images action creator, which wants to receive our term. So just like that. But we don't have access to fetch images yet, so we need to import that. So import fetch images from actions. So just like that, and now we need to pass that function to connect. So now we've connected our state like this, and we've passed a function called fetch images, which when called receives the term, passes that to our action creator with the same name function, fetch images. The result of that gets passed to dispatch, and eventually actions will be dispatched to our reducer, update the state, and things will react to those changes. Our app will react. Okay, so let's fix this component. So this function comes via props now, and these state attributes don't come from state, but they come also from props. So everything comes from props. We no longer have to pass this function down, and everything should work here as was. So the next thing we just need to do quickly before it all works is update our form component. So we're going to import connect from React Redux, and then we're going to import fetch images from actions. Okay, we don't want to export it right away. We want to do that down here, where we can export a connected version of this component. So map state to props it wants, and map dispatch to props as well, and we pass it the form component. Okay, so we need to just quickly create these things. I'm going to type it from scratch again just so you can get that repetition. So map state to props, receives the state, and returns whatever properties from the state we want to pass as props. Here we actually don't need to pass anything, so we're good. So you could actually, if you were fancy, you could say that, which sort of, whenever you don't have braces here, it returns whatever is automatic, which would be this object here. Whatever you like more, I guess, though. So now we have map dispatch to props, which is a function which receives dispatch, and it returns an object which has, we said fetch images, because that's what we want to call here. And what will that be? It will be a function which receives the term, calls dispatch with fetch images, which receives term. Cool. So just to reiterate on this, I've called these the same, right? But they're different things. This fetch images is the one I imported. It's this function which comes from our actions file. Whereas this fetch images is just an arbitrary name that I'm using to give to the thing that's passed as a prop to this form component. So I could call this something else. I could please fetch images, like that, right? But then you just need to make this please fetch images as well. So now they got different names, but they were different things anyways. They just happen to have the same name. And you can even define prop types here if you want. So this is what's being passed in, and it's a function which is required. So let's see if we did things right. So it's loading our mountains. And if we search for Canada again, or husky dogs are really cute. So it's taking its sweet time with those. I don't think these are husky dogs, but we'll go with it. All right, so let's just inspect with React so that we can see what was happening. Going to zoom in a little bit. All right, so if you remember back in MobX, we had our app here, and above it, it was wrapped in something called inject, whereas in Redux terms, that's called connect. So what that does is it gives you the ability to pass your state and your different action creator functions into your component. So here they just arrive as props. So we got our fetch images, our images array, and the different status and term. So remember, we also connected our form component, and so that's why you have this connect out here. But remember, we gave it a different name here. We said please fetch images. So you can decide the name, you can call it different things. I've found it typically works best to give it the same name as your action creator, but it's totally up to you. So let's just take a quick look at a diagram that we've created, just to talk about the flow of data through Redux. So if we start at 1, we're in our React component. So we're inside of, let's just say we're inside of app, and we make a call to our fetch images function, which calls our fetch images action creator, which dispatches the result of that. So that's here 1. So in React, we call our action. So what action does then is it either returns or it dispatches an action that gets sent over to the reducer. So remember, the reducer's role is to receive that action object, look at its type, and figure out how the data in the state needs to change. So it typically creates a copy of it and then modifies a few properties. And that was done over here, where we create a copy of our state and then modify a few properties based on the type. So those get then sent back to the store. And then because the data in our store has changed, we need to tell our React component about that so it can reflect the change or react to it, re-render it. So those get passed over to what I've called a container here. But what I mean by container is when we are connecting, there we go. It's when we are connecting our component, so our app in this case, to our store. So that's what I've called a container. Okay, so that gets sent back to the container, and then the container passes the props back into our component here. So there's it's a flow. It's always call the action or the action creator function, which dispatches an action object to the reducer. The reducer returns the new state, which gets sent back to the container or the connected component. And then that gets passed in as a prop, which triggers React to re-render, and that's why you're seeing the changes on the screen. So if these diagrams help you, both the Redux one and the MobX one, great. If not, forget it. All right, so that's the video for today. We looked at converting a little app that used component state with set state. We did that in a MobX. We went back to set state again. We redid it in Redux so that you could see the differences between the two. Hope you liked it. Have a good day. Bye.